Welcome back. Today we are going to take a look at the TINHiFi Elf. So not much in the box, so we won't go digging through that, but we will take a closer look at what this bullet style looks like up close, and it's on the larger side. This one is the CO version, so I think that stands for copper. So you do get a copper-ish color on the shells. The cable is probably copper and therefore is copper colored. So yeah, the shells are big. There is a 10mm dynamic driver in there. It is also detachable, so if you don't like this cable, you can pull it off, and it's just a normal 2-pin. And what I'll say, people will complain about the stringy cable, but I think that it's a functionality thing. You just don't want a heavier cable tugging on bullet-style shells because they're essentially hanging out of your ear and kind of hanging on by the tip, so you don't have the wrap around your ear. And I think that actually they do include the hooks for this one, I think. Yeah, so inside, so I guess I lied, so there is some stuff inside. So you do get the ear hooks if you want to change the cable to a heavier 4-core and want to wrap it around your ear. You can do that with the included ear hooks. But let's kind of jump into it and start there and say, why do you care? You know, it is a bullet style set from TINHiFi, and it has a 10mm dynamic driver in it, which is a composite driver, PU, and titanium. So I think the suspended in the dome, I think, are PU and titanium. So kind of unique, at least in a bullet style. You know, I think it's their main marketing point, so we'll point it out at least. Another reason why you should care, I think history plays a part here. And those of you who have been around the hobby long enough to remember TINHiFi prior to the T3 Plus, which was a bass-boosted Harman set, there was a T2, and T2 was probably their most famous set, most widely known set prior to T3. And that really set tin, and you can see it on the blue, kind of on this being known for more neutral style sets, and this one is kind of a very neutral style set, and that's what they were really known for up until T3 Plus. So to see TINHiFi, the Elf, take not a hugely neutral, but certainly a reduced bass shelf compared to other bullet style sets that we've seen recently, especially compared to the sleeper sets that we saw last year, which had a really huge bass shelf. I think this is a return to more of a house sound that Tin is familiar with, going back to these times, and they give you kind of lots of treble up here, which again is another TINHiFi thing that they were known for. So yeah, I do think there is a bit of history, a bit of return to their roots a bit, not quite down to the level of T2, but yeah, kind of like they did something new here, and it sort of resembles what they've did in the past. So yeah, I think it's actually a not that bad of a reason to pick it up if you are into that style of bass shelf. So who's it for? Casual users who prefer more treble to bass. And like I said, that bass shelf is more neutral. It's still boosted and a little bit, but the tilt of it, and you can kind of see here, it's still tilted this way, so there is going to be, the balance is much more here than it is down here. This sort of fills in where it should, and it complements everything else. But as far as there is a tilt to it, and it is definitely more treble to bass. The balance is tilted, like I just said, upwards, which isn't common for these bullet style sets, which are usually tilted down. Like I was talking about, the older sets, and we'll take a look at one in a second, they had a much bigger bass shelf, more of a balanced bass to pin area, lower treble area. But as I said, I think it's pretty good for TINHiFi to address a gap in the market. Lots of other bullet sets have done the heavy bass thing, so it's kind of nice to have an option. Is the driver special? At $14, I don't think it needed to be special. Where it needed to be a little special is that tuning. And again, this is kind of a lower, very shallow V shape. It's going to expose a lot of the mids. This is going to expose a lot of the treble. There's not a whole lot of hiding under mid bass here. So the driver did need to be better than average because you were going to hear a lot of it. And I think that's true. I think when you pull the bass back, I think and hear what comes through, that's what this one is like. And that happens on a lot of the sets. I think Moondrop's Aria Snow Edition was one. A lot of the sets that do a bass shelf, kind of this easygoing, slightly boosted, open the mids up so they're not hiding behind a lot of sub bass and a lot of mid bass, and you can hear what the driver is doing. That's kind of the pull back the bass situation like that this one does as well. Volume, definitely medium or lower. I think the treble will kind of get you, and that will be your limiter. That is the limiter for me. No harm in ticking it up a couple times, but I do think on some tracks the treble comes through and says you probably exceeded the volume that you should be, and turn it down a little bit. So as I said, there have been lots of other bullet sets. Tangzhou's Chang Li, Princess Chang Li. That one was very similar, and that one looked like this. So this is Chang Li in blue. I think is more a traditional bullet style that we've seen recently, that bass kind of up to 70. This is using a smaller dynamic driver, so they basically kind of trying to compensate with giving you a little more bass, but generally there's more bass there, and lots of other sets did the bullet style in the same bass shelf or even higher, and then you can kind of see they kind of not all that far from each other there. But definitely which one, your preference, which one to choose. If you like a little more bass, you're definitely going to go with Tangzhou's. If you like TINHiFi's, this concept of a more neutral, not as bass dominant bullet style set, then the Elf is pretty much right there for you. So I wouldn't say that there's a huge advantage or disadvantage to either one of them. It comes down to this maybe your first bullet style set. You like bass, get that one. You like a little less bass, you like to focus more on the treble and hear how this comes through over a little less bass, then that'll be the Elf. So yeah, I think both are priced right, and I mean personally I would choose the Princess because that is the fun one, but that's just my preference. I think other people will choose based on their preferences. Sound, it's that tilted bright V like I was talking about. It is slightly boosted. The lower still makes itself heard when called upon. It's not quite neutral. It still has a little bit of boost to it. And the bass, I think, again, TINHiFi leaned more into the upper emphasis, but they picked a very reasonable bass shelf that doesn't exclude genres. And again, when you look at it, it looks kind of flat, but in your ear, it's actually not bad, especially when tracks have a good amount of bass that actually comes through fine. Again, this part is a little bit elevated, and this is the dominant part, but this will show through when it has to. But when you get a lot of treble area, this tends to dominate, and it becomes harder to hear that. So kind of what I caught at the end there. The amount that you hear is really dependent on the treble. So especially for rock, things that have a little more treble and a little lighter on the bass, it may come across as lightweight on bass for that reason. The mids, again, I think the amount of bass warming that actually flows through, they kind of get this slight carry through from the bass into the mids. I think that was the right idea. That balances against this little bump up here. This is a little elevated. So kind of bright, throw a little warmth into it to kind of soften the edge a little bit. And I think this works, pretty well for more casual users who are expecting voices to have, a little bit of more natural to it, a kind of a more organic sound. I think just bleeding a little bit into it does that. This hits the more experienced users who are looking for those sharper details, a little more resolution, a little more sharper notes. I think that comes through there. And the two work together in that way. You end up with mids that aren't too sharp or over sharpened because you have a little bit of warmth on the bottom end. They sound a little more natural, but then for more experienced people, you are going to hear this little bit layer right on top. So you do end up maybe like a mild version of what TINHiFi C2 did. C2 was kind of a really bright version of this. This is sort of more general appealing, of kind of the same signature where you have a really heavy emphasis on that sharp detail. So that's pretty much what I said there. The contribution from the driver. So like I was just talking about, somewhere right in those sharper upper mids is where you hear it really come through, right where they put that emphasis. This is sort of where you hear the advantages of that driver that they use. It's kind of really sharp upper mids, nicely detailed, comes through with a little bit of resolution. Kind of right there at Cheat Codes, I remember, I think this is the second track on their CD, where it's not really hitting the bass hard and you're not hitting the treble too hard. Right in the midsection is sort of where you hear the driver and what it can do. And yeah, I think it actually does pretty well. Treble, the tuning leans right into it. As I said, occasionally it's a bit too intense. Like I said, the volume-wise, I think that'll be your limiter. it has a TINHiFi house sound to it, in that mix of slightly more neutral bass and a little brighter treble. I think they hit their house sound, and I think it was all intentional, and this is what they like. A bit more present, a bit sharper, a bit more defined, all those things that I just talked about. That C2 was actually really good at. You get kind of a hint of that coming through on this set. They really traded potential for fatigue, and like I said, push the volume a little bit, it will get a little bit fatiguing, but it really gives them a signature that they prefer, and I think they executed that pretty well, and I really can't argue with what they did there. Stage is probably where I would argue with it and say they got the treble that they wanted, but it actually shrank the stage, and it's mostly an in-head experience. Fine for casual users, but more experienced users, you'll sort of recognize this little, if you put a little too much here, it flattens everything out. They don't necessarily have, even despite this big peak out here, you don't pick up a whole lot of upper treble out of this set either. So everything sounds pretty good. It's just more of a, an entry level $14 experience on stage. So I think Chang actually did a little better on stage, but certainly not bad. And certainly I think TINHiFi would say they got what they wanted here, and people who are really into that will pick up one of their other sets. So can't argue with what they did there either. So thank you guys again for tuning in, and I will see you next time.